Hello everybody, welcome to probably this year's only upload because this video will be a bit of a long one. Today I'm going to try to explain to you why you shouldn't buy that camera that you've been looking for and want to purchase. Now, what do I mean by this? I have categorized a few of the most popular categories that beginner photographers want to pursue, from general photography to telephoto photography, pretty popular one from what I've seen, and video, which is technically a lot of photography. And I've split each of these sections up into two. The popular section with low-end cameras, starter base model cameras that aspiring photographers want to buy, and some alternatives that, while older and maybe more used in some examples, will actually be the much better choice for you as a photographer, both in the present and in the future. Now, there are a few caveats to the alternatives that I'm going to show in this video. First up is the size. You're trading some tiny, compact little cameras for some bodies that are quite a bit larger. So, if you don't want to support all that weight, I get why you would want to choose a smaller body, so this video might not be for you. But if you are willing to try out a slightly bigger camera with, slightly heavier weight, you are going to get a lot more in return in terms of, ruggedness, weather resistance, and ergonomics and buttons, dials, controls in general. The control scheme on any bigger camera is a lot better. Also, what do I mean by real photography? Well, I don't mean the person that just wants to buy like a point and shoot like tiny little camera to take photos of their families, of birthdays or whatever. This video is not for that person. This video is for the people who are beginners, who are just starting out and maybe are at that point and shoot sort of stage, but they want to get a real camera with real like interchangeable lenses and a much bigger sensor for now hobbyist photography and videography, and maybe even in the future some professional photo and videography paid clients. You're a lot more likely to get money with these cameras that I'm going to show you, because they deliver much more professional results. And this does matter actually somewhat. They look way more professional in your hand than a Canon R100 with the kit lens. I hope that you liked this video, you liked watching it, and that you're actually going to take some of the advice that I gave you. These are just some examples. You can find alternatives to my alternatives as well in the same sort of camera categories, size ranges, and price ranges. Or you can adjust, or you can adjust these, or you can adjust the set of advice for maybe a lower or even a higher budget. If you have a different budget than what you targeted here. Here I targeted sort of a mid-end $500, $600, $700 budget, 6, 7, because that's what most Westerners and general people starting out, that's the maximum amount that they usually want to put in. But that doesn't mean that they have to get something awful for that amount. In this video, I'm also going to target cameras specifically on the MPB website. These are theoretically they are used cameras, but the people managing this camera store, they're very transparent about every single camera. Every tiny little issue is noted and easy to see on the camera's page, and every camera is individually photographed. You get rights to return the camera. You get I think a 12-month warranty. So while these are used cameras, and I'm only comparing used to used cameras, while most beginner photographers would tend to choose newer cameras, off Amazon, you're just inbox new cameras. I want to compare used cameras to used cameras, so I can do a fair sort of apples to apples comparison, and obviously not compare a new camera to a used camera, because that's obviously going to be a better value proposition. I'm also not comparing, local marketplace sites like eBay and Facebook Marketplace or any equivalent of that in your area, because prices can vary wildly between region. And I've noticed that MPB seems to be pretty consistent, at least when it comes to America and Europe. In other regions, good luck. I don't know much about those regions, so I can't talk about them. But this video is mainly targeting Americans and Europeans who are seeing photography and trends and such in cameras and such on TikTok and Instagram and other socials, and they want to get started too. This video is for them to get the best camera that they can in this sort of price range. So let's begin the comparison. Now I have everything split up over here into the general category where I have two examples for each, the video category where I have one example, and the telephoto category where I also have just one example. The split up is between the popular setup categories. I'm targeting here both cameras and lenses, combos, something that people want to get started with. And the better variant, from my experience using plenty of cameras and bodies and lenses, some alternatives that will fare better for both beginner and mid-range sort of photographers, aspiring enthusiast photographers. We have here the Nikon Z30 and the Nikon 16 to 50 millimeter lens as the first general setup that many beginner photographers want to choose. And while I have I'm not shaming people who are using these cameras already, or who really like these cameras for what they are, because they are pretty small. I can get behind that. But the Z30 and its competitors are lacking pretty severely in the case of buttons and ergonomics. Actually, the Z30 is the best one in its class, I would say. We will also talk about the worst in its class. Meanwhile, this 16 to 50 millimeter lens, while it does present itself as, a small all-rounder lens, it's not that great. It's not made to be good. It's just made to be small. It's pretty soft. The chromatic aberration is not that good either. And this lens is made to be as inconspicuous and, kind of toy-like as possible. Makes the manufacturer profits, and the customers are pleased because they get a small lens. My alternative solution to a general photography setup is this. The body being a Nikon D610. This is a DSLR body from about 2012, 2013. And while the age of this body and the looks might scare you, this is actually a much better camera to use for photographers who want to be enthusiasts and passionate in photography and not just sort of point and shoot users. This has way better ergonomics, even though it is heavier. The ergonomics are way better. It's a lot more rounded. The controls are better. The screen doesn't flip out, sadly, but you have plenty of dials and buttons to compensate for that. And the materials themselves, they're a lot better. These cameras are weather sealed. They're a lot more resistant to, harmful conditions that a low-end camera like the Z30 might not be able to handle. And for the lens, we have this Tamron 35mm f1.8 lens. Now, if you're a beginner photographer, you're thinking, why choose a prime lens? Why limit myself to that when I can just get a zoom lens and I have a wider range? This is fixed. Why do I want a fixed lens? Well, two things. First up, prime lenses, or fixed focal length lenses like these, they're actually some of the best value for money lenses because they don't have to worry about zoom ranges. So they have a fixed focal length, but the quality and the aperture is generally much better. These lenses are a lot more open. This is an f1.8 lens. It has image stabilization, and this is the kind of lens that you really want to have if you want to get those nice bokeh shots, portrait shots, as a wider aperture provides a lot more background blur to your pictures. This lens, while yes, it is a bit bigger, it is also a lot higher quality. Just looking from the photos, I can tell that the plastics on this don't feel like they're going to fall apart, and the rings on these prime lenses, they're pretty smooth to operate, so are the switches. And this is a much better setup for general photography. I'm talking portraits, weddings, cars, dogs, cats, flowers, really just general stuff that you don't need anything too specialized for. This is a much better setup, although it's not quite as compact, and this will be a theme in the video. If you can deal with a slightly bigger camera and a slightly bigger lens, the pictures are going to look a lot more photographic and a lot less phone-like, thanks to this camera having a giant full-frame sensor and this lens having a giant f1.8 aperture. This is what provides those professional-looking blurry background photos while the subject is very sharp. If you want to have that look, something like this would be the setup to buy. Moving on to our second sort of general photography setup, this is the popular choice, the Canon R100. And when I said I was going to talk about toy-like plastic bodies, this is the main culprit, the main example, the main subject here. This has no flip-out screen, it has, a single dial right here, and the general quality of this body is very poor. You have very few ports. Hold on. There you go. You have just a microphone port and a remote port, no video out, no headphone jack in. The batteries are tiny, the battery life is also pretty bad on these. The viewfinder is also really small. And the materials on this remind you more of a, like disposable, like a point and shoot like a Kodak something, not an actual camera to get started with real photography. And for the lens, we have a similarly plasticky, toy-like, and awful quality lens. This is the RFS 18 to 45 f 4.5 to 6.3. While this does have image stabilization and a decent autofocus motor, the aperture being 6.3 at the telephoto end really doesn't make much justice even of this camera. Your photos, especially if you don't know what you're doing in editing, will end up looking worse than your phone if you have a lens like this. The aperture is so close that it doesn't really make much difference having this lens as opposed to just having a phone. And I'm targeting this setup specifically because it's one of the most popular setups that I see on social media, TikTok, Instagram. Any new photographer who's upgrading from a point and shoot, they have a Canon R100 and this exact lens right here, and they're either passionate about their crap quality photos, or they're questioning why their camera isn't taking better photos than the last one, or their phone. Well, there's a few reasons why, and I'm going to show you an alternative in the same budget, in the same price range, to fix those issues. Alright, so sticking with the bigger, older camera and prime lens formula, because this is a very, very tried and true formula. Most professional photographers will have some prime lenses and a big camera like this. Maybe slightly newer, but this still does the job regardless. This is a Canon 5D Mark III, again from about 2012. This is a pretty big full-frame camera, so if you don't mind the weight, this is a very fun camera. This is a very ergonomic camera. It is a bit heavy, but because of the great ergonomics, it's not that hard to hold in your hand actually. The autofocus is pretty good for photos at least. The viewfinder is a lot better. It's an optical viewfinder, it's a lot bigger, and the control scheme is also better. You have this joystick right here, you have joysticks and dials and plenty of buttons for dedicated actions, which low-end cameras really, really lack. And it's not fun trying to fiddle around like touch screens or like D-pads trying to get to your setting. It's a lot easier having buttons for every main function of your camera as opposed to just having, a D-pad. And the lens right here, this is the Canon 50mm f1.8 STM. Again, a prime lens, fixed lens. This one is actually even smaller than the last one, but in this one the focal length is a bit tighter, you're a bit more zoomed in. This still provides the same, bokeh look, the f1.8 wide open aperture, and the autofocus, being also STM, is pretty quiet actually. You won't hear it like whirring and buzzing around all too often. So this is a great setup for photography, general photography. Again, cars, dogs, cats, people, weddings, stuff that needs the normal focal lengths and generally a photography focused camera. Alright, on to the second category, which is the telephoto category. You want to take pictures of wildlife, birds, animals, or you do plane spotting, that's a semi-popular thing, car spotting, train spotting, really anything spotting, and you're using a telephoto lens because you want to get closer. This is a setup that most people would pick. The Canon 2000D, also known as, I think, the Rebel T7 in America. This is one of their lowest end models from about 2017-ish. Again, a tiny viewfinder, lackluster ports, lackluster controls, only this dial right here and a D-pad, not even a touch screen. The autofocus is achingly slow. If you want to shoot any video with this camera, the autofocus is achingly slow in video, like live view mode. So your videos will end up looking like this. And again, I'm sounding like a broken record, but the materials on this camera are pretty bad. It's just plastic fantastic, low end, and if you don't think you need any more, why settle? And for the lens, we have a bit of a meme actually in the photographer community. The Canon 75 to 300, either Mark 1, Mark 2, or this most popular one, the Mark 3, which is also the worst one, because by the Mark 3 they made it so plasticky and they've got so many corners while not actually improving the optical quality at all. This is a lens from the 1990s, so very old lens. The autofocus is as well very old. You'll hear a lot of buzzing and whirring, and you will miss a lot of your subjects actually, especially if you're doing wildlife. The autofocus on this lens is a no-go. It's way too slow. and you won't actually get any shots with this lens. Also, it's a very, very soft lens. It's optically bad. What do I mean by optically bad? There's vignetting, chromatic aberration, general softness, and fringing. It's not a good lens in any way, shape, or form. Yes, it's telephoto, but it's not good. You're going to miss a lot of your shots, and you're probably going to question yourself, why are you not taking better photos with a setup like this? Moving on to the alternative, this is a setup that I've actually tried in this exact form right here. For the body, we have this Canon EOS 70D. It's a mid-range body from around 2013. It has a flip-out touchscreen, a decent viewfinder. It has a top LCD screen, a lot more buttons, an actual second dial. The interface on this camera is way better. The UI and navigating around it, you can touch the focus. That's a pretty big thing for beginner photographers. And very importantly, this was the first camera to feature Canon's dual pixel autofocus system, which means that in live view and video shooting, the autofocus will be less like this and more so like this. Which means that you can use the live view mode to its fullest extent, and that flip out screen as well. So you're not limited in that regard. You can shoot at sort of weird angles to get maybe some sort of wildlife shot or something that you're spotting in the sky. And for the lens, we have what at first looks like a similar lens to the one I've just showed you, but this is a much better lens. This is a 55 to 250 millimeter. It is still f4 to f5.6, and it does have stabilization and STM autofocus, which means that yes, the autofocus is a lot quieter and a lot faster. This lens is way better suited for a more modern DSLR like this, and while it has slightly less reach at the telephoto end, this camera also has a better sensor, so you can just crop in the rest of the way if you really wish. This camera could actually keep up with some wildlife or sports or spotting shots. The autofocus is much better at tracking subjects, both when it comes to the camera and when it comes to the lens. And the experience overall will be way better on this setup for again a very similar budget. Moving on to a slightly different category, this is the video category. Beginner video shooters, not really photographers, people who want to make short films, vlogs, YouTube videos, TikToks, or edits of any kind. The most likely body these people are going to choose will be something like this Sony ZV-10, which, while it is a mirrorless body and it's nice and compact, this is a pretty outdated body by today's video shooting standards. I've owned a camera with the same sensor and the same video capabilities, the A6500, and what it does do, 4K at 24 FPS, with the full sensor. Let me show you something called rolling shutter. Is this phenomenon whereas the sensor is scanning each individual line to make your 4K frame of video, it's scanning so slow that as it's going top to bottom, your camera is actually moving, and any fast-moving subject will end up looking tilted like this. While this may not be the biggest issue for you, there's also other issues with this camera, such as, there's no viewfinder. If you ever want to do photos, good luck, you're going to have to use this rear screen. The batteries are really small. I had these in my old A6500 and they did not last for very long. I had like 5 of them, which is a bit of a nightmare to keep them all charged. And as you can see, the ergonomics are also not great whatsoever. This is more of a compact point and shoot type of camera and not necessarily meant for people who want to get started on videography. This is more for vloggers having some sort of like pocketable little camera. And for the lens, well, I could have chosen the kit lens, as that is a more popular solution for beginner videographers. I chose instead this 50mm f1.8 lens, trying to be a little bit more optimistic. It is a prime lens, so you do have that bokeh looking effect, and it's not that bad actually. This isn't an awful lens. I'm not going to shame on it, like the other ones, which are pretty bad. This one is decent, although I feel like 200 euros is a little bit much for what you get. But this is a pretty old design as far as E-mount is concerned. And other companies have surpassed this level of quality and this value for money at this price point in when it comes to prime lenses. And this is the alternative for a beginner video shooter at around the same price point. This is a Panasonic Lumix G9 camera, and while you might not have heard of Panasonic if you're just starting out, it's also a pretty competent camera brand, especially when it comes to their video lineup and video cameras in general. Even though this is their photographer focused camera, it still does 4K 10 bits at 60 fps using the full sensor, which in this case it's a smaller like 4/3 sensor, but it's still plenty for most video scenarios. You are going to get slightly less background blur for that, but it's well worth the trade-off. All of the rolling shutter issues are gone, and the in-body sensor shift stabilization on this camera is very good. I almost said much better than the ZV-10, but that one doesn't even have in-body stabilization. This one has pretty top-class stabilization, at least for this price point, obviously. We're comparing in the same ballpark, apples to apples here. This one has a flip-out screen, but it's actually touchscreen and with a much better interface and UI than the Sony cameras. You could use a lot more of this camera in touchscreen, and the buttons themselves and the layouts are also a lot more ergonomic on this camera than the ZV-10. I actually wanted to purchase this camera at some point, but I got a bit more money and bought a Lumix S5 instead as an upgrade from my old Sony 6500. So I have researched this camera a lot and I totally rate it, including for some photography. This is a pretty good hybrid camera, but for video especially, this has some pretty cool features for the price point. The lens here, as you might see, I have two tabs open because in the same budget, I managed to fit two lenses. This is the first lens, the main lens. It's also a prime lens, a 25mm f1.8, which actually, since this is a smaller sensor, will be equivalent to a 50 f1.8 if this was a full frame camera. So it will be a bit more zoomed in than what you would expect 25mm to be. But this is a pretty good focal length for general videography and photography too as well. Most scenarios don't require anything much wider or much more zoomed in than a 50mm equivalent like this lens. Optically it's pretty decent, it's actually a pretty good quality lens, but the best feature, its killer feature, is that since it has to cover a much smaller area, being made for 4/3 cameras, this lens is actually much smaller than a mostly equivalent Sony 50mm lens. So while the camera itself, the Lumix G9, is a little bit bigger, it compensates with this prime lens being quite smaller. And just for funsies, just for giggles, I've also thrown in a second lens, just so we're at the same budget as the Sony setup. This 7.5mm f3.5 fisheye. This is a much wider lens. It equivalates to about 15mm in full frame land, which if you go on your phone and go to the ultra wide like 0.5 or 0.6x camera, imagine that, but just even wider by very slightly. So that's about how wide this lens will be on this camera. Very fun lens. This is manual focus lens because ultra wide lenses don't come very cheap, so you have to cut corners somewhere. You will have to deal with the manual focus on this lens, but it is a very fun option when you're not really depending on the camera and you just want to have fun. This is a fun second lens for street videography, even photography as well. This works very good as a hybrid setup, unlike the Sony, which is more vlog focused. This lens is also pretty good for landscapes and general videography and photography, where you don't have to hurry as much and you can set the camera on like a tripod or a gimbal, adjust your focus and shoot a very nice clip of whatever is in front of you. If you visit like nice tourist destinations or mountainous areas or something like that, and these two lenses both pair very well with this Lumix G9. It's more meant to be a hybrid camera, but the video features are so good that I didn't want this camera not to be included in this video because it's just great value for money for the body and also for the lenses to some extent. Alright, so I hope that you liked what you've seen in this video, and I hope that, low-end camera shooters aren't going to be too offended by this video because, because while low-end cameras may have their place due to them being compact, they also have their place mainly because, the manufacturer profits a lot on selling cheap little cameras with, old electronics to people who don't know any better. I know slightly better, and I'm guiding you to a lot better for the same amount of money. And again, I hope that you've enjoyed this video. The only thing that I'm expecting and hoping is that you go out and follow my advice and, get a camera based on, the categories that I've set out in this video. It doesn't have to be these exact models if you can't find them or if they're too expensive, but follow the general category of camera. If I'm comparing a low-end mirrorless camera to an older but higher-end full-frame camera, try and adjust that to your price range. Maybe you have $200-300 for a camera. Maybe you have $500-600. Maybe you have 1,000. Maybe even more. This isn't a universal one-size-fits-all video. If I wanted to do that, I would have sat here for a lot longer talking about cameras. I could have done cameras for every budget point. Actually tell me if you want to do that. A video like this for a lower or a higher budget point. And this is it for today's video. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Maybe this year, maybe not.